Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the finals match of Revolution Rumble 2024, Tier A between Henry Reynolds and Zachary Showalter. You will probably recognize Henry from a previous video where he eliminated me from the winner's bracket, and you will recognize Zach from previous videos as I have done a style breakdown on him before, and I have fought him quite a number of times back in the days before this channel was started. So going right into it, what I know is that Henry is a very aggressive fencer who likes to use good forward momentum and attacks in preparation in order to get attack priority and come out on top in this particular rule set. And Zach, I know from previous fights, is also a pretty aggressive fencer who has really good point work and can do a very nice single time onsets in order to stab you right when you think you're safe and usually wind it out and get nice control points back when that was a thing. So it should be a very interesting fight and one where we are going to have a lot of interesting adaptations. So starting off on our first exchange, the first thing to point out is the difference in footwork and stance. Henry has a very unusual way of planting his feet, given that he keeps them very close together and pretty linear. And I believe the reason he does this is that it allows his back foot to remain closer to his target so that he can go into his deep lunges and explosive steps. Zach, on the other hand, keeps his feet in a more traditional HEMA stance, but he has added a little bit of bounce to his stance since the last time I fenced him. And I would say that this little bounce allows him to much more quickly pivot off of his footwork and allows him to play footwork games more explosively, which, as we see in this first exchange, is used to its fullest. Zach explodes forward with a kind of jumping Scheidel Howl, vertical cut down straight to the top of the head. And Henry gets an attack in prep, or gets attacked in prep, and attempts to try to parry it and then pivots to a hand shot, which of course gives Zach not only attack priority but forward momentum and gives him the point. For the next exchange, we see Henry execute the move that he so effectively used against me quite repeatedly, namely that he comes into measure, explodes forward with a long, deep lunge, which prompts his opponent to go up into a kind of high guard, expecting a very deep thrust or a very deep cut, only for it to pivot at the last second and with very great extension land to the hands. Now, something that is worth pointing out here is that a lot of what it comes down to in this fight is whether or not Zach is going to be able to appropriately shut down or parry these explosive forward momentum attacks from Henry. As we saw with his fight against me, he is very good at getting them through the guards of even very defensive fighters, which means that Zach's normally offensive style is going to have to counter this by putting forward pressure of his own so that Henry can no longer safely engage in this kind of revved up, far from the pocket attack. So for our next exchange, we see an adaptation from Zach here. After he has seen Henry's ability to explode forward and press his advantage with attack priority, Zach is now taking a couple inches back in order to give Henry a bit of an extra run-up so that even he cannot reach his target in time before it can be parried. And of course, it is very intelligent at all times if you're experiencing a person who can consistently land their attacks to simply back up, because any distance that you add for them to have to close in order to attack is distance that you need in order to parry. So it has gotten Henry to back off a little bit, at which point Zach sizes up what the distance that this is and throws his own explosive forward thrust. Now, this is something that I've seen from Zach a large number of times, and part of the reason it works out so well for him is that if you watch this footage, you can see just how high he gets his shoulders and the point of his thrust while still explosively going forward and making up the range. Normally, a thrust must come directly from your shoulder line in order to have maximum reach, and this is still true. However, if you put a little extra oomph into your forward lunge, or leap, as Zach does here, what it allows him to do is raise his shoulder line to an even higher point, and then thrust from a point higher than his shoulder line, which normally would take away reach, but because of his explosive forward momentum, he has just enough to reach his target. And most importantly, because of this height, it allows him to engage in a bind where even if his opponent is cron parrying, it's significantly more likely that the strong of his blade is going to be so high up in the air as to even be above the head of his opponent, that any attempt to kind of swish it to the side with a crump-style parry will mean that you're going to engage with Zach strong, which means that he's going to have a very, very strong position when that bind does exist, and he's much more likely to be able to drive that thrust through to its target without being displaced. It also explains why so often, although you don't really see it in this fight, Zach would get control points back in the days of Long Point, because this really, really high thrusting position is perfect for countering anyone who's trying to hit you in the arms or the head at the exact same time as you thrust, as it's significantly more likely that their weak is going to fall directly into your crossguard and get stuck there. For the next exchange, we see another great demonstration of Zach's point work, and another particular way in which he winds his thrusts that is going to be interesting for anyone wishing to duplicate this. Now, when Zach thrusts here, what you can see is that he throws a little bit of a bait hand shot, which Henry parries, but then as Henry lowers his hands in order to try to throw a very confusing feint, Zach simply extends his hands forward, but he doesn't just flick his point in like a lot of people, like myself, will normally throw thrusts. Instead, what he does is he takes his hands from his low position and winds them 180 degrees, basically flipping them upside down. So the part of his crossguard that was pointing down is now pointing up. And what that allows him to do is it allows him to create a kind of line where his crossguard is occupying a wide array of space that covers a line from the bottom of his torso to about the middle of his shoulders. And what this allows him to do is, as I stated before, allow any attack or thrust that is coming at him at the same time to kind of get caught up in the crossguard. Whereas just thrusting forward does not protect you from any oncoming attacks or thrusts. This winding motion does a much better job of keeping you safe, though it's not perfect. But one thing that's key to point out here is that this winding motion often, in most people, causes their point to go out of whack and go in a bunch of crazy directions. But what Zach has gotten very good at is using this winding motion while keeping his point on a very, very tight point. Meaning that when he does this wind, despite the fact that his sword goes from kind of pointing upwards to kind of pointing downwards, his point stays in more or less the exact same spot, which means he's much better able to land those thrusts, even on a precise moving target like his opponent's head. So for our next exchange, we see Henry return to good form. He comes forward directly off of the go and throws a big, well-timed and well-executed attack, which he feints into a couple different directions and manages to hit Zach. Zach, for his effort, tries to do an attack and prep of his own, but is unable to get out of range or dodge the attack that is coming for him. And what it's important to point out here, though, is that Henry has been successful every single time that he has done these kinds of big attacks straight from the jump. However, you would be wrong to think that this is something that he should be doing over and over again on every exchange. Because as we've seen, Zach has been able to seize the initiative, or the vor as it's sometimes called, on more than enough exchanges now where Henry has to be wary of his point work. While Henry is able to throw his kind of classic attack every once in a while, every few exchanges, and be successful with it, I have a feeling that if he had done it over and over again, he would not be as successful. And it's important to point out here that one of the big differences and the reason why Zach is doing much better than I was in this similar situation is that his aggression and his point work are forcing Henry to take it more seriously, whereas I was unable to land any thrusts aside from one from the open of the match. And in your inability to get someone to kind of back off and be a little bit more defensive is an often underappreciated skill of having a good offense. One of the things I criticize about myself over and over again is that I am far too defensive. And what that means is that for someone like Henry, they are pretty much given a green light to do whatever they want to me with their initial attack. And Zach here has diffused that, not necessarily through any specific technique, but just by being aggressive enough to make sure that Henry has to take him seriously in the opening moments of every single exchange. For our next exchange, we see a clear-cut example of how Henry has to be wary of using his trademark high commitment attacks too many times. Zach has been keeping his distance, trying to bait out those big attacks, and while they have worked for Henry several times up till now, this time we see Zach's adaptation bear fruit. Zach has been keeping his distance, which adds the amount of time it takes for Henry to close that distance and land his attacks, and while it does give him many more opportunities to feint, there's only so far your feet can carry you. Zach continues to move backwards, manages to parry the attack, and throw a very nice riposte. And it's worth pointing out once again that The high line and the bind point are of significance here. Zach throws his riposte at the level of his shoulders and maybe arguably just a little bit higher, and as a result lands in a bind when Henry goes to parry, where his middle or strong is on the weak of Henry's sword, which allows it to kind of crush through Henry's block and hit him in the head. This is a really important thing to take note of because Henry tends to fence with his hands down a little bit, and while that behooves him very greatly for the kind of back and forth fencing where both people are going for each other's hands, in this particular case it did not help him, because when he did his kind of wall parry by shifting his hands over to one side and hoping that his sword would create a big old wall on his right side, Zach's attack was able to crush through, particularly because this does not raise the hands high enough to put the strong in the area where the attack is going to land, which, again, as we talked about, allowed Zach to crush through the block and land his attack. For our next exchange, it is Henry's turn to try and adapt. Now, Zach has shown an ability to thrust from the open and get very, very close to landing it or landing it altogether. And Henry has yet to be able to parry it successfully, though this time he is. Utilizing a page out of Zach's book so far, he manages to keep enough distance so that when Zach does his leaping thrust, he is flat out too far away to land it, which means Henry has a very easy time of parrying it. But the way in which he parries it is actually very interesting. He crumps it all the way down to his left side, but then rather than pulling off over the top and going for some high target, he winds back around under and off of his right side throws an underhow to Zach's arms, which might have hit the body depending on how you look at it. At the exact same time, though, we see the problem with this kind of attack, and that is when you wind underneath after you've parried somebody, it's often quite simple for them to simply raise their hands back up and throw a follow-up attack towards your head. Now, in a right-of-way tournament, this isn't as much of an issue because Henry has gotten the parry here, which means that everything he throws afterwards is of priority as long as it doesn't hit the body, which it does come very close to doing. My advice would be that Henry had already done such a great job of parrying Zach's attack, he probably would have simply been able to throw a right horizontal cut on his right side, which would have hit Zach in the hands. But the point here is that Zach now has to be very wary of throwing these thrusts from open, which so far has been what's been keeping Henry from throwing his attacks from open, which means that we're still in a war here where both people are trying to make sure that they're the ones getting the initiative off of the jump on every exchange. And right now, it's been going back and forth where Henry's been getting advantage and Zach's been getting advantage in pretty much equal measure. Just as though it was scripted by me, what we see now is the next exchange, both fencers being a little bit defensive, as they both realize that both themselves and their opponent have been vying, perhaps too enthusiastically, for the aggressive position on the outset. Now, what happens is probably the longest exchange since the first, where both fencers are moving in and out of each other's range and basically going back to try to feel each other out. What ends up happening is that Zach throws a little bit of a probing hand cut, unfortunately, at the exact same time, Henry takes a step forward to do a stepping parry and simply misjudges. I don't think this was really a big mistake on Henry's part. Being able to step forward and parry a probing shot would have actually put him in a really great position when that was parried. However, he just simply mistimed it or misaligned it slightly, and Zach's attack managed to slip in under his crossguard. Now, this isn't the last exchange, and I've already skipped some exchanges further in, but I want to cover this last one because it has another interesting adaptation. Up until now, both fencers have been vying for that first offensive attack, the one that's going to back their opponent up against the wall and put them in a situation where they have to parry, at which point that attack either lands or they parry the riposte and throw another attack. And so far, Zach has only been successful in either parrying Henry's initial attack or in throwing an initial attack of his own. And this is the first exchange and the only exchange so far where Zach was able to back Henry up and then win in the pocket after his initial attack was parried. And I think this is important to point out because there's a lot of interesting aspects of this particular exchange that explain why it worked here where it didn't necessarily work before. And that has a lot to do with the fact that when Zach threw his initial attack, it seems like he was aware of the fact that he was unable to close the range quite deep enough, but was able to get into a kind of mid-range. Now, up until now, where Henry has excelled is where he is either able to hit somebody at max range or parry them and then hit them back again at max range. And this mid-range seems to be a little bit of a weakness of his, particularly because he seems to like to throw wall parries, which I mentioned earlier. Wall parries being that idea where you kind of keep your hands low and just windshield wiper them from left to right over and over again, using the length of your sword to kind of put up a wall so that anything that's coming from the left or the right can't quite hit you. But as you see here, when Zach throws his thrust, he gets parried off to the left side, which means that he then responds by throwing a follow-up Zwerkow to the low left opening, given that he was parried on his upper right. And this is a classic thing that anyone who's done a Meyer Square knows how to do. But what's key to the success here is at the range, he is actually able to wait a beat after his thrust misses, simply keep his sword more or less there, parry the follow-up attack from Henry, and then throw his Zwerkow. And one of the reasons this works so well is that the Zwerkow can often move around the line at mid-range, where any kind of attack that wants to cross that mid-line is going to get bound up in the swords and the range that they're at. As you see here is that Henry manages to parry the thrust, but when he tries to come back into the center line, Zach's sword is still in the way. And it's still in the way because it's simply held there in a position where you know some attack has to come from that area. If Henry had instead thrown a Zwerkow from that other side, he could have done exactly what Zach had done to him in this exchange. But because he has a habit, I guess you could say, of always going back down that center line from max range, he didn't properly adapt to the mid-range exchange he was having here and didn't quite come out on top. So a really interesting adaptation and a really good execution of the Zwerkow and why it can be so prolific at this range. Now, this fight ended up going to Zach, but I would say it was a really close fight despite what the score would reflect, because, at least in my opinion, there were a couple things that maybe could have gone either way, or some doubles that were thrown at that maybe weren't quite doubles. But if you'd like to see more fights reviewed from this tournament or other tournaments, feel free to send me any emails at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com. I'm actually catching up to my backlog now, so if you are annoyed that I wasn't ever reviewing your footage, now maybe I will. And I'll see you on Thursday.